listen to the aspirations of the people living in Donbass and the Russian-speaking residents of the country, to respect their entirely legitimate desire to use their mother tongue and to teach their children in that language, and also to honor the memories of those who liberated the land from fascists rather than those who fought on the side of fascists and had a hand in the killing of hundreds of thousands of people during the Second World War. After Ukrainian military adventures butted up against the determination of the people of Donetsk and Lugansk to defend their lands, the Minsk agreements were signed and the package of measures was adopted with the aim of implementing it. There was once again hope for peace and that the Maidan authorities would be sensible, having exhausted the desire to submerge Donetsk and Lugansk in blood. There was a particularly great amount of hope invested in the election in 2019 of a new president of Ukraine, who promised at long last to establish peace in Donbass. However, those who hoped that the Ukrainian authorities would take a peaceful stance were unfortunately mistaken. Kiev not only very quickly returned to its bellicose rhetoric and continued the shelling of civilians, but also did everything it could to sabotage and ultimately destroy the Minsk agreements. And most importantly here is the flat refusal of Kiev to speak directly with the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk, despite the fact that this requirement is a central structural element of the package of measures. An unambiguous confirmation of an unwillingness to engage in that dialogue is something we've heard repeatedly from Ukrainian leaders in the last few days, including from the permanent representative of Ukraine during the Security Council meeting that we convened on the 17th of February to discuss the implementation of the Minsk agreements. After that, it became clear once and for all that Ukraine did not intend to implement the Minsk agreements, and I would like to recall and remind my colleagues on the Security Council that in all other conflicts, be it Libya, Syria or Yemen, we all demand and call for direct dialogue between the parties to the conflict. And it's only in Ukraine, for example, the Ukraine that is for some reason an exception to this rule. From some statements today, one may understand that a number of our colleagues are ready to bury the Minsk agreements. However, I would like to remind you that when the Minsk agreements were concluded, the LPR and the DPR had already declared their independence. The fact that Russia today recognized that in no way changes the makeup of the parties to the Minsk agreements, because Russia is not a party to the Minsk agreements. We have repeatedly declared this, and in so doing, in this regard, nothing has changed. It's another matter that the Minsk agreements, part of the provisions of which were supposed to be implemented way back in 2015, have long been openly sabotaged by Ukraine with the backing of our Western colleagues. And today we can see that many colleagues want to sign up to the idea that the Minsk agreements are dead, but that's not the case. And Kiev is still bound to implement them. We remain open to diplomacy for a diplomatic solution. However, allowing a new bloodbath in the Donbass is something we do not intend to do. Unfortunately, we are forced to note the extremely negative role played in all of this by our Western colleagues, led by the USA. Instead of forcing Kiev to implement its obligations, they have merely been openly egging Ukraine on, repeating the meaningless mantra that the obligations under the Minsk agreement are not being implemented by Russia, which, as we've repeatedly underscored, is not even a party to the Minsk agreements. Moreover, while for the last few weeks already whipping up unfounded panic around the allegedly impending Russian invasion of Ukraine, our Western colleagues have been unashamedly cramming weapons into the country, sending instructors there, essentially nudging the Ukrainians who have concentrated an 120,000-strong military contingent along the contact line towards an armed provocation against Donbass. The joint efforts of the West and Ukraine have inflated an air bubble that simply had to burst. In the past weekend, there's been a sharp increase in the intensity of Ukrainian shelling of residential areas of LPR and DPR, and the 1,600 shells have been shot. Civilians have been killed. The territory of the republics has been penetrated by subversive groups who have carried out or tried to carry out sabotage of critical infrastructure. As I already said, there are casualties from among the civilian population. The LPR and DPR have declared general mobilization. It's in Russia and not Ukraine that refugees have flooded to. Over the last few days, the number of evacuated women, old people and children has reached around 60,000 people, and Russia is hosting them and providing them with conditions for them to be housed and supported. There has also been shelling of some towns and villages on Russian territory near the border zone, and so it has become clear that Donbass is on the brink of a new Ukrainian military adventure, as was already the case in 2014 and 2015. We cannot allow that. That is why the Russian president heeded the opinion of parliamentarians and members of the Russian Security Council, and you know the rest. A detailed statement from our head of state about the reasons of this decision that has been taken was broadcast in detail by all the world's leading media. Today, it's true, we have heard an open distortion of what the president was talking about in his statement about history and the genesis of this situation, and about the fact that he allegedly said that he wants to reconstruct the Russian Empire. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to call upon our Western colleagues to think twice, to set emotions to one side, and not to make the situation worse. No one other than you can hold back the militaristic plans of Kiev and force it to stop the shelling and provocations against the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, which in these new conditions could have extremely dangerous consequences. In accordance with the agreements that were signed today and on the basis of their requests from the Republic, peacekeeping functions on their territories will be carried out by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Distinguished colleagues, in conclusion, I would like to note that in today's statements, most of you did not find any place for the more than 4 million of residents of Donbass. It's as though you've been cancelling out their fates from your statements from 2014, generally calling them pro-Russian separatists. At the same time, you decided that the illegal coup in 2014 only wanted to discuss with the new authorities how their rights would be upheld. That was all they wanted to do. In the last few days, with the sharp intensification in military activity from the Ukrainian army along the contact line, the lives of hundreds of thousands of women, children and elderly persons have once again, as in 2014 and 2015, ended up under real threat. And the main aim of our decision was to protect and preserve those people. And that is more important than all of your threats. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Ukraine.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under-Secretary, it is with unease that I will now remove my mask. And it is not because of the COVID virus. We are all vaccinated. There are vaccines for COVID. It is because of the virus that has so far no vaccine. The virus that hit the United Nations, and the virus that is spread by the Kremlin. The delegation of Ukraine has requested this urgent meeting to draw the attention of the Security Council to the illegal and illegitimate decision by the President of the Russian Federation to recognize the occupied parts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine as so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Today, the entire membership of the United Nations is under attack. Under attack by the country that occupied the membership of the Security Council in 1991, bypassing the UN Charter. The country that occupied parts of the territory of Georgia in 2008. The country that occupied parts of Ukraine in 2014. As stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, following the urgent meeting of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine have been and will remain unchangeable, regardless of any statements and actions by the Russian Federation. Ukraine unequivocally qualifies the recent actions by the Russian Federation as violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The political leadership of the Russian Federation shall bear full responsibility for the outcomes of the decision taken. Recognition of the occupied parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine may be considered as unilateral withdrawal by Russia from the Minsk agreements, and well as its disregard of the decisions taken in the framework of the Normandy Fall. This step undermines peaceful efforts and ruins the existing negotiating frameworks. By the decisions adopted today and those that may be adopted tomorrow, Russia legalizes the presence of its troops, which have actually been in the occupied areas of Donbass since 2014. A country that has fueled the war for 8 years is not able to maintain peace as it claims. What will happen next? We want peace, and we are consistent in our actions. Today, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine has sent a request on the basis of the Budapest Memorandum to the guarantors of security of Ukraine, demanding immediate consultations. The meeting of the UN Security Council and the special meeting of the OSCE have been initiated. We insist on the full-fledged operations of the OSCE SMM to prevent provocations and further escalation. An emergency summit of Normandy 4 has been requested. We expect from our partners clear and efficient steps of support. It is critical to see now who is our true friend and partner, who is on the side of the UN Charter, and who will continue to deter Russia by words only. We are committed to a political diplomatic settlement and do not succumb to provocations. In accordance with Article 51 of the Charter, Ukraine has the inherent right to individual and collective self-defense. We are committed to a peaceful and diplomatic path, and we will stay firmly on it. We are on our land. We are not afraid of anything or anyone. We owe nothing to anyone, and we will not give away anything to anyone. There should be no doubts whatsoever, because it is not February 2014. It is February 2022. Another country, another army. One goal is peace. Peace in Ukraine, peace in Europe, global peace. Excellencies, we must do all we can to make sure that the problem of Donbass is resolved through implementation of the Minsk agreements. That was said here in the Security Council chamber just 4 days ago, said by the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister in the chair of the President of the Council, with a reference to President Putin. President Putin, who has taken a decision that we discussed today as a threat to the rules-based order, to the UN Charter, in particular Article 2 of the Charter, as well as to international peace and security. Peace and security that the Council has been conferred a primary responsibility to maintain under the Article 24 of the UN Charter. And in accordance with the Article 39, the Security Council shall make recommendations or decide what measures shall be taken to maintain or restore international peace and security. The delegation of Ukraine requests the Security Council members to exercise the above duties. We invite the Russian Federation to reread again and again, carefully, today's statement, where the Secretary General considered the decision of the Russian Federation to be a violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and I thank the Secretary General for this powerful statement. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that it remains up to Russia to abandon its long-lasting strategy on Ukraine based on threat and use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of my country, and re-engage in what we all have committed to, fundamental principles of peaceful relations enshrined in the UN Charter. We demand from Russia to cancel the decision on recognition and return to the table of negotiations. We condemn the order to deploy additional Russian occupation troops in the territories of Ukraine. We demand immediate and complete verifiable withdrawal of the occupation troops. Dear members of the Security Council, the United Nations is sick. That's a matter of fact. It's been hit by the virus spread by the Kremlin. Will it succumb to this virus? It is in the hands of the membership. Today, the Kremlin copy-pasted word by word the decree on Georgia of 2008. Word by word, copy-pasted, copy-pasted. No creativity whatsoever. The copying machine in Kremlin works very well. Who is the next among the members of the United Nations? The question is open. I thank you.
I, as President of the Security Council, am obliged to say this. I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. I start by thanking Under Secretary General Rosemarie DiCarlo for her briefing. Mr. President, only 4 days after our last meeting, this Council meets again to discuss the situation in Ukraine. On Thursday, there was consensus in the Security Council that the Minsk agreements, which this Council unanimously endorsed by its Resolution 2202, need to be implemented, including by the Russian Federation. Today, we are confronted with the very opposite from Russia. President Putin's decision to recognize the separatist self-declared People's Republics in eastern Ukraine is not only a blatant breach of Security Council Resolution 2202, but also of basic principles enshrined in the UN Charter. It is another flagrant and deliberate violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity after the illegal annexation of Crimea and the instigation and fueling of the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine since 2014. Russia has repeatedly insisted it was not party to the conflict. Today it unmasks itself and shows that it always has been. Mr. President, my government condemns Russia's violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. With our allies and partners, we will take firm and adequate measures in response to Russia's breach of international law that will have serious economic, political and geostrategic consequences. And I call on all UN member states to join us in condemning Russia's actions of today. Today's decision comes in the context of an unprecedented buildup of Russian forces around Ukraine over the last weeks and months. These forces seem poised to attack. We have seen a flare-up along the line of contact over the last days and efforts that appear to fabricate a pretext for a Russian attack. Moreover, Russia has declared its readiness to deploy troops in eastern Ukraine. The UN Charter is crystal clear. It unequivocally prohibits the threat of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of states. The current Russian force deployment around Ukraine can only be considered as a further threat against Ukraine's territorial integrity as a whole. Mr. President, I call on Russia to live up to its obligations as a permanent member of this Council, and I urge Russia to immediately revoke today's decisions and recommit to the Minsk agreements, and in line with the Normandy 4 and what was agreed on. Russia must not cross the international recognized borders of Ukraine. Moreover, Russia must immediately withdraw its troops from the regions bordering with Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. And I call on Russia to recommit to the rules-based security architecture in Europe, which has been built over decades. Russia's decisions have put this order under serious strain. We call upon Russia to instead return to the path of diplomacy, instead of shedding further blood. And Germany will spare no diplomatic effort in this regard, while steadfastly standing by Ukraine, its territorial integrity and sovereignty, and the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for her statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
The meeting has been adjourned. That was the UN Security Council meeting to discuss the Russian government's recognition of two separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. Now, the meeting has currently adjourned. We've heard remarks from all sides. The move by Russia to recognize the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk have been condemned by the member nations here. This has now ratcheted up tensions in eastern Ukraine. The move comes in clear violation of international warning and sanctions. And for more on this, we are now being joined by our correspondents Susan Teherani from New York and Siddhant Sibal from New Delhi. Thank you both of you for joining us. Susan, coming to you first. Now, Russia's move to recognize the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk has triggered alarm. President Joe Biden has also signed an executive order prohibiting trade and investment in the two regions by U.S. personnel. What can you tell us about this?
Right. That executive order came really shortly after that recognition of those two regions, really known as the Donbass region. And President Biden made clear that this is a first step. It is separate, these sanctions on entities to do business with individuals in that region, and it's separate from those hard-hitting sanctions that the United States and its allies have in store for Russia should it declare a full-on invasion. We will be hearing more about that from the president himself, but this was an executive order that was passed from the White House and relayed to the American people and the public by Jen Psaki, the press secretary. Of course, there's talk that how far does Russia need to go before those hard-hitting measures that the Biden administration and its NATO allies have been talking about for months are going to go into effect. whether or not the sanctions that it has imposed right now, this executive order, is going to be enough to deter Vladimir Putin from moving forward or not. But this is the step that this administration has decided to take unilaterally on the part of the United States for Russia in that region of Ukraine for now, separate from those sanctions that it wants to take with the international community.
All right. Also going across to our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who is joining us from New Delhi. Siddhant, you've heard the remarks. What can you tell us about India's stance? And do you think diplomatic solution is still possible in light of the escalating tensions now?
Well, when it comes to diplomatic solution, it looks difficult. But if you look at India's position, India has said that India has been saying in the past that dialogue is the only way forward, and calling all the parties to make sure that there is de-escalation of the tension. But essentially, India also prioritized that it's the well-being of its national. That is the number one focus for New Delhi. In fact, even as we speak, Air India flight is coming back to New Delhi from Ukraine, bringing back Indian nationals. But all in all, if you look at India's stance, for past 2 months, India, of course, has been briefed by both Moscow and Washington. But what India has been saying that it is the Normandy format, the Minsk Pact, that should be the focus area of conversation. But it looks like that the Minsk has been practically torn into shreds because of the decision taken by the Russian President Vladimir Putin hours ago. And of course, the focus now will be how things pan out, especially when it comes to diplomacy, because it looks like that the West is eager to put sanctions which will be imposed anytime soon now.
Right. Once again, going back to Susan Tehrani joining us from New York. Susan, once again coming to you, EU too is preparing sanctions on Russia. Now, we've heard about President Joe Biden's executive order, but he stopped short of imposing sanctions on Russia just yet. What can you tell us about the practical implications of this?
During that emergency UN Security Council session that just wrapped up, and we heard part of the UK said that the UK is ready to impose sanctions against Russia as early as tomorrow, being Tuesday. And I think we're going to hear more about those set of sanctions coming from the European side. And we'll see if it's in accordance with the United States. You know, it has to be extremely thought out, because the fear right now is that these sanctions are going to be similar to the ones that President Obama spearheaded back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and it really did not have the effect that the West wanted, and Russia went ahead. And, you know, despite the fact that we did hear the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations during that, again, Security Council meeting that just finished here in New York say that this is not 2014, this is 2022. And that is true, but perhaps the stakes are very higher right now in 2022, and Russia's ambitions are much wider. So there is a lot to look into. President Biden's decision-making right now will have huge implications, and how he moves forward, whether with diplomatic maneuvers or with sanctions, is going to be telling. But I do also want to say that it's also telling that the Ukrainian foreign minister is in Washington. He was in Washington today speaking with President Biden, and he decided not to go back to Ukraine and decided to stay another night here in Washington as well. So some are saying whether or not that's a sign of uncertainty of the Ukrainian government in Kiev, and whether or not, if anything happens with Russia and Ukraine, a high-ranking official in Ukraine should be outside of Ukraine to form a government in exile. That is floating around in Washington as well right now.
Right. All right, Susan and Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us with all the updates on this. Moving on now, we're now being joined by Mr. Spencer Crishley, communication consultant, author of Patriots of Two Nations. Thank you so much for joining us. What do you make of these developments? How do you assess the impact of this on the situation on ground?
Unfortunately, this looks like it was all too predictable. The whole supposed argument over the supposed expansion of NATO, I think, is just such an obvious fig leaf to cover President Putin's actual ambition, which is simply to annex Ukraine. I think we need to take him at his word that he considers it part of a historical Russia. And he seems clearly to have the intention of reestablishing as far as he can the old borders of the Soviet Union, but call it the new Russian Empire.
Right. Of course, now recent shelling, Russia's move, this has done nothing to quell the tensions here. It has only escalated it. What do you think is the way forward? What can we expect in terms of next steps from Russia?
I think we're going to see more of the same. I mean, Vladimir Putin has been behaving this way as he's been consolidating his power over the years as an absolute totalitarian ruler, essentially, which has been to invent pretexts for expanding his territory. He did that in Georgia. He did that with the invasion of Crimea. He did that after the 2014 ouster of the the pro-Russian government of Ukraine. And now he's doing it again with a far, far larger force, by the way, than he has mustered in the past. So I think we can just expect continued expansion. This, so-called recognition of these so-called newly independent republics in the east of Ukraine, again, is obviously a fiction. It's just a pretext for him to begin the invasion, and I'm sure he'll continue to expand westward through Ukraine for as far as he can get away with.
Right. Also, how do you assess the role of the UNSC and also the West? What are the next steps that you think they can take to diffuse tensions?
I've actually been very heartened by the response of the NATO alliance, and in particular, the response of my own country, the United States. I think many of us have been concerned for many years that liberal democracy seems to have been losing its sense of its own spine and its sense of its own heart and soul, and seems to have been uncertain about the values that it stands for. And I think that one of the things President Biden has done very, very well during his brief presidency so far is to reassert the core values of liberal democracy, which, the entire democratic world is founded on. And I think that the combination of intelligence and focus and aggression that is not belligerent has been just right. And I'm glad to see that many people who have much deeper knowledge than I do in international affairs and defense matters share that opinion.
Right. Mr. Spencer Crishley, thank you so much for joining us with your insights on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.